Good morning, Sophie.
Sophie, how are you?
បាទសុខសប្បាយបាទ I'm fine, thank you. How about yourself?
Fine, thank you so much. It's great to be
Good.
with you.
It's a pleasure to see you again. Welcome to the Cambodia Daily's Idea Talk program. First, let me remind my audience, Sophie Richardson is China's affairs expert at Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C. I met you a while back. I'm glad that I can see my old friend. Thank you for being on our program today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
Sure.
I'm sorry that my Khmer isn't up to...
I'll do my best to translate to our Khmer audience toward the end of the show after I speak with you. Okay, you know as well as I do, China has claimed historical right to almost all the areas in the South China Sea and deployed its armed forces to confirm the claims. It threatens America's friends and allies in the region, including the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. Australia, India, and Japan are also drawn into the defense for freedom of navigation in what they consider a free international shipping route. My first question to you, Sophie, how will the South China Sea issues be any different in the near future than today if the U.S. has a change of policy or a change of leadership?
It's a great question. And I should say that when I first started at Human Rights Watch about 15 years ago, almost all of our work on the Chinese government's human rights record still looked at issues inside the country. But over the past decade, we have had to look at human rights violations committed by Chinese state actors in other countries, like in Cambodia, but also through or at key international institutions like the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I think, the bottom line of a lot of that work suggests that even when the Chinese government has agreed to play by established international rules, it often doesn't. And so I do think that, regardless of which administration we wind up with here in the United States, there is real concern not just about the Chinese government's agenda in the world, but about whether it can be relied on to play by the kinds of rules that are established in treaties set out particularly by the United Nations or by international norms.
Yeah. Right. So far, we have witnessed that China hasn't obeyed or observed as much as we expect. I forgot the law of the sea when the Philippines brought the case to the International Court of Justice. The U.S., as expressed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo during his recent Asia tour, has pledged full backing for Taiwan and other ASEAN member states if China uses force to threaten any one of them, with claims to the small Spratly and Paracel Islands. Washington backs its words with actions, deploying warships to the South China Sea theater. Do you think we'll go to war with China?
Well, I certainly hope not, because the people who would suffer, are largely innocents in this debate. But I think this is the long-standing history of this region, this incredible tug of war between the significant power in the region, China, and the significant power on the other side of the Pacific. And going back, not just 50 years, but further, these are some of the dynamics that I think governments and, more importantly, individual human beings across the region have to live with.
Okay. My next question. Threats for Taiwan appear to be greater than threats to some ASEAN states, as Beijing keeps saying it will use force to invade the island of more than 24 million people because it is regarded as part of China. Taipei, in return, spent billions of dollars rushing to purchase advanced American-made weapons to defend itself, to prepare for the worst. Will you see the armed conflict in the region drags the U.S. into fighting a proxy war?
Well, again, as a human rights organization, we obviously, would prefer that not to happen. If it does, there are established laws of war, that are in conformity or that are set out by human rights law that parties are expected to abide by. But I do think that, the Taiwanese government at the moment is in an interesting position. It's gotten appropriate recognition around the world for the way that it has handled the coronavirus pandemic in a very democratic and rights-respecting way. It is making the point that it wants to be a truly constructive member of key international organizations it's shut out of for political reasons. And I think what we're seeing from Beijing is a clear reaction to greater and growing interactions between Taipei and other capitals around the world.
Okay, we have a question from, I'm trying to read this to you, a question from our listeners and viewer of the Cambodia Daily program. His name is Rotha Victory. What should people in Indochina do for protecting them from China, attempts to dominate the area? What action that Human Rights Watch can do?
Well, I think there's a long list, but at the top of that, I think, first of all, don't take out any anger or frustrations about the Chinese government's behavior on ordinary people from China or people of Chinese descent. We have seen, horrifying episodes over history in Cambodia and Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, where innocent people were the victims of that kind of frustration. I also think that, more democratic governments in the region are better positioned to expose and stand up to and push back against Chinese government threats to rights in other countries. That's more complicated in the parts of Southeast Asia where, the leadership is not particularly responsive or respectful of human rights and democracy.
Yeah. Okay. Do you see the next U.S. administration, whoever wins the White House, we will know the result, official result, sometime this week or perhaps next week? Do you see the next U.S. administration may lower or heighten the risk of a Sino-U.S. war over the South China Sea?
Hassan, it's a great question. I think that the Trump administration has clearly been very aggressive in a lot of ways towards Beijing. And while, their recognition of the threat the Chinese government presents is welcome, many of their reactions are certainly not human rights friendly. Many of them seem more designed to provoke a response or beat Beijing up or score points in the trade war than to make life better for people across China or to effectively push back against Chinese government influence in institutions like the United Nations. I think it's an open question what a Biden administration China policy is going to look like, and there's a lot of concern that it might be too soft, but I think we would see a Biden administration pursue much more collaborative, multilateral initiatives rather than the Trump administration's preference for sort of lashing out.
Right, rather than a unilateral approach. Okay, right. Do you think we will know better in the first 90 days after, he takes office?
You mean if Joe Biden is elected?
If.
Yeah, I think they understand that this is a real foreign policy priority. It's become such a prominent issue for the Trump administration. I think if we don't see clear policy by the end of the first 100 days of a new administration, that in and of itself would tell us something, and I think it would not be reassuring.
Yeah. Okay. In your view, what is the best possible path, diplomatic path, to avoid war or even nuclear war with China?
Wow, that's a question I wasn't prepared for.
Well, we like to hear your view as much as you can, as you possibly can tell us.
Right. Well, I really think that confronting the Chinese government in a multilateral fashion, not doing it unilaterally, doing it with allies, making that cross-regional, and doing it through established international institutions is the way to go. I mean, those institutions exist precisely to prevent, that kind of outcome. And one really hopes that leaders think very carefully about the well-being of people in the countries they represent, but also, what happens to people across China. One thing we found very distressing in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, when it was still largely confined inside China, or at least as far as we knew it was confined inside China, was that people weren't terribly concerned about what was happening to ordinary Chinese people who were suffering from the virus and suffering as a result of covering up the information and denying people access to adequate care. There's more attention on the Chinese government's role once the pandemic spread worldwide. But I think the pandemic has shown us that what happens to people inside China is on some level the same as and not distinct from, and has consequences for people all over the world. And so, I want leaders to think about what China's policies are doing to people inside and outside the country and react in a way that's good for everyone.
Another question from our listener and viewer, posing this question to you: does Human Rights Watch has any list of requests, prepared for the new U.S. president regarding, any form of intervention on human rights violation in Asia or Southeast Asia?
I can assure you that lengthy transition memos are in the works. The question is, whether anyone will be receptive to them, and especially if there is a change of administration. I think that administration is going to be getting a lot of advice from a lot of different actors about all different aspects of policy.
Right. A lot of stakeholders. Yes. I'd like to shift our focus a little to Cambodia, if I may, which has cozied up to China and benefited tremendously in hundreds of billions of dollars from the Chinese grants, soft loans in exchange for land concession that reportedly may be used as a military base for operation on the Gulf of Thailand to the South China Sea. Will Cambodia pose high security risk for future U.S. and international maritime navigation, in your view?
Well, first I want to make a little bit of an amendment to the way you introduced that question. I think it's accurate to say that the Cambodian government and its senior leadership has cozied up to the Chinese government, not that the entire country agrees with that approach. And, I think the best way to answer your question is to say that in our view, the Chinese government's interest in aid of all different kinds to the Cambodian government is about securing its particular economic and security interests across the region, not securing the betterment of life for ordinary Cambodians. And, we've done work on different aspects of Chinese involvement, or I should say Chinese government involvement in Cambodia. And that's a kind of involvement, that takes place without respect for human rights, particularly around economic development. Belt and Road Initiative projects that don't have any sort of expectations of consultation or compensation. And I think it's really magnified in the difference between the haves and the have-nots in the country, and the fact that the leadership in Phnom Penh has no particular regard for human rights.
Yeah. You work mostly on the issues involving China and other ethnic groups like the Muslim minority Uyghurs to the northwest of China and the Tibetan people in Tibet that China took back in the 1950s. Can you tell us a little bit more what you found from your work, your research?
Sure. The Chinese government has a long history of treating ethnic and religious minorities as fundamentally disloyal politically. And what we've observed over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly under President Xi Jinping, is a push to make those communities less distinct in their ethnic, religious, cultural, linguistic identities, and into very obedient, loyal servants of the Chinese Communist Party. And in Xinjiang in particular, which is a northwestern region, about half of the population there are ethnic Turkic peoples who are mostly Muslim, is a campaign of mass arbitrary detention in which Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims are forced essentially to give up their distinct identity and swear their loyalty to the party. It's an extraordinary development to be taking place here in 2020. It's a kind of, it's abuses on a scale that the world was supposed to not tolerate anymore.
Now, the Chinese government, especially this foreign ministry or some other high-level officials, kept saying that what we see, in the news report in the West, is not true with regard to the way the Chinese authorities treat the Uyghur people, minority people in Xinjiang. What do you say to them?
I say to them, if that's the case, why is it that none of the hundreds of Uyghurs and Hui, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, that Human Rights Watch has interviewed over the last 5 years can call or speak to their family members? Why is it that their family members can't leave the country to come visit them? We now are able to see Chinese government documents that state clearly the authorities' intention to carry out these mass human rights violations. And look, for the first year or so after which these mass detentions started, the Chinese government denied that these facilities existed at all. And then, under pressure, they changed their story and said, yes, well, they're vocational training schools.
Okay.
And then they were under more pressure and they changed their story again. So they're really not credible interlocutors on this topic, especially when you speak to individuals whose family members are affected and understand how real these violations are.
Is that true from your work, your research, that the Chinese authorities set up surveillance cameras every corner in the Xinjiang or the Urumqi capital city of Xinjiang? Is that true? To monitor the Uyghur movement?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on this topic in particular, and the use of surveillance technology, not just to monitor people's everyday lives, but to gather enormous amounts of information about legal behavior and treat it as criminal is extraordinary. And I think the world needs to be a lot more aware of the Chinese government's use of this kind of technology at home, but also its willingness to sell it abroad to other governments that are also notorious for human rights violations.
Do you think this will happen to Cambodia, or may happen to Cambodia too, if the Chinese, has full control, based on what we've learned that Cambodia owes a lot to China?
Well, I think it's entirely possible that Cambodian authorities could want to use this kind of technology too, and I think the Chinese government would have no trouble selling or providing it. I hope there would be a strong pushback against that because it's a serious threat to human rights.
Yeah. What about the Tibetan people? Any success? Their claims to free themselves from the Chinese, occupation?
Well, I think there are extraordinary efforts inside and outside Tibet to preserve language and culture and religion, but there is no room for people to advance perfectly legitimate, even peaceful grievances around how their lives are governed. We've even done some work recently on the issue of Chinese authorities slowly removing education in Tibetan language for Tibetan children from primary schools. And so that now almost all children across the plateau are taught only in Chinese except for a Tibetan language class. And that has real consequences for how people remember traditions and engage in their culture and practice their faith. These are serious threats alongside appalling restrictions on things like religious freedom or movement.
Yeah. One day the Tibetan may not find their root, their identity. The same is true for the Uyghur people. My last question, Sophie. Please share your thought and analysis for our audience. What can the U.S., especially the next administration, do to alter the course of a potential China-Cambodia alliance that may be to the detriment of the U.S. interest in the region?
Well, look, I think all governments that care about human rights need to come together to challenge Beijing's approach, not just inside the country, but internationally and in key international institutions. That also should apply to common positions between, for example, the US, the EU, Japan, others, as they deal with human rights violations inside a country like Cambodia. It does not help when those countries take different positions or one is willing to provide support or political cover to the government there and not others. I think that what we need to see is a recognition that there is a singular threat in the world today to human rights worldwide, and it requires a coordinated response. And maybe my last thought for you is simply that people across Cambodia have suffered far more human rights violations than anyone should ever have had to. They deserve a break, and that should be a priority.
Yep, definitely. I thought I had my last question, but now we have another question from one of our, guests. He is a human rights advocate from Cambodia. Yes. Perhaps you know his name too, Thun Sarai.
Oh.
Yes. He asked this question, posed this question to you. In order to challenge the ruling party, all the political parties, all of them, I don't know how many now, should come together as one to challenge the ruling party, the party right now, the party of Hun Sen. Do you agree with that suggestion, that point?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that of all of the people in my life who've inspired my own work and taught me a great deal about human rights inside and outside Cambodia, it's Thun Sarai. You have our highest respect.
Yeah, and he should be proud honest, of what he's doing.
I think the driving force ought to be a concerted effort of people who do respect human rights and do take democracy seriously, pushing back against autocracies. I don't feel well enough equipped about the current differences between political parties to make a more specific recommendation than that. But I do feel comfortable saying that in the years that I've had the privilege to spend time in Cambodia, there are enormous numbers of people who care deeply about human rights and democracy. And it's long overdue that they be allowed to have the governments they've tried to choose that are interested in those same things too.
Final thought. Anything you'd like to share, you'd like to add? Please do.
That it's been too long since I have visited Cambodia, and I would love to go back.
You still want to go back at some point?
Absolutely.
Yes, sure.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Sophie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'm so happy to see you back. And we would like to welcome you at some point in our next topic. I hope you don't mind.
You're very kind. I'd love to.
All right. Sophie Richardson, China's expert. China's director for human rights in Washington, D.C. And thank you. Goodbye, Sophie.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.